Everybody ready? So starting my time now. So before I get into the meat of my speech, I'll extend a round of thanks to everyone in the room. Our judges are a relatively large audience. Our opposition and my, as always, wonderful partner for all being here today, without whom we could not have this debate, and without whom it would not be nearly as fun. I'm my partner, of course, stand in firm affirmation of this House would take action to preserve the student right to protest ought to be protected. We're going to start with some framework on that bad boy right there. As this is a debate, the topic in English, I think the topic should make sense in English. So I think when we're discussing this ought to be protected sort of just reaffirms the would take action to preserve the student right to protest. I really hope we don't have a disagreement on that because I don't want to get into subject predicate stuff right now. Would is going to be defined as a benefit detriment analysis, saying that this would be the best course of action. We're going to be defining this House, the United States federal government, as the actor most pertinent to this discussion in the status quo. We're going to be defining take action as a link to a plan that somehow furthers the action of an actor versus the status quo today. And we're going to be defining preserve the right to protest as preserve the restricted free speech already allowed in the status quo. So the right that exists today, we will be ensuring that we take action to preserve that right. Our plan is going to be to eliminate disciplinary measures for peaceful protest in public educational institutions. This means that there is no such thing as grade targeting, or there is, but it will not be allowed. There is no suspensions or other disciplinary matters. We are going to offer for you 3 contentions, each which contain 2 subpoints, and each which have a lot of fun. And the first contention is going to be civic engagement. First subpoint is lesson. We affirm in this that we want the students to understand the value of civic engagement and participating in a democracy. Schools that in the status quo punish you for speaking out, punish you for going to protest or attending an otherwise organized protest, currently disavow this idea. This is a powerful tool of an educational institution to teach a lesson that they can show that they value peaceful protest and that they value student activism and civic engagement. We see that under our plan, by removing disciplinary measures, we make it seem as though schools are good with this. Why? Because they should be. We see that in this plan, we want to restore faith in democracy and demonstrate what democratic citizens can look like. If schools do this, and if we affirm the plan and the resolution, you will see that people will have a healthy respect for democracy, they'll participate in it more, which benefits the democracy as a whole and improves the quality of life of everyone living under the scope of that. We also enable a checking mechanism to check on abuses of a democracy. For example, we see massive amounts of protests today, or not today, I'm sure there are somewhere, for guns. We see them against racism, racist rhetoric, the Women's March. We see that they have real social impact, and we check abuses of a government, which promotes, again, the health of the democracy and the vivaciousness overall. Our second subpoint is going to be peace. We also see that preserving the status quo's definition of what the student right to protest is this is a student right to protest peacefully. There are protests that are not allowed under the status quo, and those are ones we're not preserving because there's nothing to preserve. We see that this establishes peaceful protest as a mechanism and a preferred mechanism for moving forward. What this does is enable among this generation an example of that peaceful protests are a viable option and something we want to preserve in a democracy versus, say, non-peaceful protests. What this does is this decreases the violence and the often high-heated tensions we see in these sorts of protests, which improves civic engagement and decreases violence, therefore increasing quality of life as a whole across the board. Our second contention is going to be discrimination, and our first subpoint is race. We see oftentimes when peaceful protests are combated in the status quo within educational institutions, they specifically target people of racial minorities. An example of this is when African American students in some schools tried to kneel or sit during the Pledge of Allegiance were yanked out of their chairs and thrown and forced to stand up, specifically targeting African Americans disproportionately among others. We see that the combatants of these peaceful protests in the status quo disproportionately affects these racial minorities. This decreases their ability to participate in the democratic process, de-incentivizes their participation in the future, and silences the voices of these minorities in the democratic government we hold and love truly today. At least I do. What we see, therefore, is that through our plan, by not allowing this combatants to continue, we disavow and we discontinue what has become a racist methodology for controlling the voices of these minorities. We reaffirm that. We not only allow them a place in the democratic process, we show them that they are welcome in the democratic process, and we reintroduce their voices into the discussion. Our second subpoint on this is going to be class. We see that in the same way, oftentimes when people are forced to make a choice between, say, missing out on school and facing those disciplinary measures and people that participating in protests, people who are of lower socioeconomic status who can't afford to miss class and can't afford to be the target of grade targetings or suspensions are more likely to miss the protest and to have to stay back. We see that this, again, follows the same idea of the racism point that we made. We see that this disavows individuals that can't participate for fear of the consequences, and it specifically disavows people of lower socioeconomic status. This de-incentivizes their participation in the democracy, and it also takes out and literally removes their voice from the democratic process as a whole. If we want democracy to respect the values of the people, reflect their values, and best uphold the government for their benefit and for their greatest benefit, we cannot continue this. Peaceful protests, or rather protecting them the way we are through our plan, is going to reinstate those rights and assert them for the future. Go ahead.
So how does the USFG do this? Like, what's their plan? Like, monitor every single school and every single school district individually?
What the USFG does is it has the ability under the public schools, because remember, we're not doing this in the private sector, public schools to be able to limit the amount of disciplinary measures or remove them from handbooks and prevent their administrative officials, they're the ones obviously that fund them and pay for them, and they prevent them from being able to institute these disciplinary measures. Our third contention on this is going to be discourse. First subpoint, marketplace of ideas. We see that allowing peaceful protests to exist, especially in areas of high school and collegiate education and public educational institutions, allows for there to be a greater discourse of ideas, which heightens our understanding. If there is greater participation in the democratic process, which we further here, we see that people are more likely to have a discourse, especially a peaceful discourse, one that we're preserving in the right and the status quo. We see, therefore, that furthering this right allows for the greater discourse, which follows with greater understanding. This greater understanding shows us that we can create a sort of tolerance that allows us to cohere and to make better policy together, and also to decrease the amount of polarization we see in the status quo today. This has greater benefits for the democracy and greater benefits for people living under the democracy as a whole. Our second subpoint on this is going to be social progress. We've seen in the past that preserving the right to social progress, or preserving the right to peaceful protest by students, has worked. An example of this is collegiate protests against apartheid in the 1980s. The United States had a very pro-funding apartheid policy back then. Massive amounts of collegiate protest changed that idea. Barack Obama actually participated in those. Fun fact of the day. But what we see, besides me reading his biography in 8th grade, shows us that these college protests do have an impact. They have shown over the time that they have led to social change. They've led to the divestment from racist regimes. They have shown that they've already seen massive progress, or starting an underlyings of progress on guns. We've seen, therefore, that there is social progress if we preserve this right. Taking these steps forward and showing this and just reavowing this right, or vowing it in the first place, shows that we can make real social progress in the democracy, and again, everyone living under it. For these reasons and more, I urge a vote in the affirmative.
This will be framework at the top, 2 disadvantages, and basic order. Is everyone ready? Okay, so I'd just like to extend a thanks already for being here at this stadium with people that are watching this round. So thanks for making this possible. Hopefully I'll make it worthwhile. On the framework level, we're totally fine with everything they put forward. My mechanism of net benefits, it's not going to be a framework debate. I want to make one observation at the top here is that basically that what the negation is going to be doing is we're just saying that it's going to be net beneficial, but this House does nothing. That hasn't changed status, but we're not running a power plan. We're just running disadvantages to the actual plan itself. So let's get into the first disadvantage, which is going to be civil disobedience. The uniqueness here is that protest against policies shows that the issue is more important than education itself. So when you see the status quo, when people, they talk about this a lot, the amount of risks that people take to go and protest outside of their class when they know there could be repercussions, this gives value to the protest. When there are risks and people choose to do something besides those risks, they're showing how important the issue is. The link here is that sanctioning of the protest devalues the act of civil disobedience that they're doing. You're going to see this in a few ways. First, we're going to have absolutely no idea how to value this because people can feel free to go out and protest literally anything that they have varying opinions on. We have no way of knowing how important the issue is to them. It could be extremely important. It could be completely not important at all. We're not going to be able to know that. An example of how sanctioning makes things less easy to basically rally popular support is looking at Martin Luther King. So Martin Luther King, when he worked in the South, when he was garnering popular support for his movement, what he'd do is he had a very specific style of protesting in which he knew that the opposition to him would react violently. He knew that he would either be put in jail, that he'd be attacked by dogs or by police, because he knew that he would garner some sort of response that would be perceived as negative by the general populace. In doing so, while putting himself in danger, he made it so that people would see the atrocities that were being committed in the status quo at that point. If the people in Birmingham, if the people in Albany had just been like, sure, that's fine, we'll let you protest, and then we're going to move on with keeping segregation, he would have been incapable of committing the wonderful change that he was able to get going. The instance of this is going to be in Chicago. When he moved up north, he found it much more difficult to rally popular support because people let him protest. They would scream at him from the sidelines, but they would not act violently because it was a different system there. This system of segregation was more economical. It looked like housing would be discriminated, that people wouldn't be taken care of. It was much more difficult to garner popular support. The internal link here is that this is going to lead to apathy. So what's going to happen is that people will walk out and people will protest and they'll feel like they've done something. They're going to feel as if like I have stood up for social change, I have done the protest, when nothing's really going to have changed because they're not going to garner any sort of popular support. They're not going to garner any sort of movement. And so they're just going to end up stop protesting. They're going to say, well, I did my part and I'm out. That's great. I protest and I've done my job and I've on the scheduled date, and then that's all that's going to happen, which is going to lead to the impact of we're going to cement oppressive systems because people will just not protest as much. It's just not going to happen. People are going to feel content with what they've done. This is going to decrease the chance for change. When you're not able to consistently rally support, you're not going to be able to have the change that you would if you're able to garner the popular support and increase the size of the movement. On to the second disadvantage of oversight. The uniqueness is that many student protests are not sanctioned in the status quo. They talk about that a lot of all the potential things that are thrown down on people who are protesting, the students who are protesting. The link is two things. One, the AF sets a precedent that that any and all protests must be given equal protection, so that basically anyone who decides to go and walk out and protest must all be given equal protection no matter what they're arguing for. This gets a little bit back into like we're not going to know how much they value it, but basically everything must be under equal protection, or you're going to see that some government entity is going to decide which protest is legitimate or not. And so they'll get to make the decision based on whatever they want. There's going to be no way to enforce that this kind of protesting for gun control is okay, but protesting for abortion is not, and that is going to lead to two internal link scenarios. So the first one is that if we're allowing for any and all protests to exist, you're going to sanction harmful views. Basically, you could have a protest for Black Lives Matter one day and a protest for the alt-right the next. And that's going to lead to a huge clash of values, and it's going to lead to a lot of bad things happening because you're literally sanctioning white supremacy. You're sanctioning, entrenching the same political ideologies that we're theoretically trying to stop, and that cannot happen. The second internal link scenario is that if we're deciding what protest is legitimate or not, that basically you're just increasing discrimination because you're allowing the oppressor to decide what the oppressed get to protest about. If we get to decide, well, if you look for the current Trump administration is obviously pro-gun, if they decide, well, I'm not going to allow any pro-gun protests or anti-gun protests to happen, that's going to lead to there's not going to be any sort. It's going to be much more difficult to garner any sort of change, and so power is never easily given away. And so if we're allowing an entity to decide what protests can and cannot happen, it's going to lead to the impacts of structural violence is going to increase. You're going to not only entrench but continue the problems we have in the status quo. You're seeing an increase in discrimination because you're literally providing a platform for racist and horrific ideologies to spread. On to the case. Their first advantage is civil engagement. They say that basically there's currently there's things that are being disavowed, and that we need to value peaceful protest. And the negation's argument is going to be that we value peaceful protest better by literally breaking laws. So peaceful protest is going to be more effective in the world of the negation because it's not just going to be walking out and then turning around with no repercussion as if nothing had happened, but it's going to actually do something. It's not like we don't need to restore faith in something because we don't need to restore faith in schools, right? We need to restore faith in the way that we can change things. If they're just going to put this blanket statement that we're not fighting for change, they're just saying you're allowed to say this stuff and then nothing's going to end up happening anyway. And so the world of negation, which is the status quo, has the greater chance of actually solving things. The second point I want to make here is they provide absolutely no impact to this. So both subpoints they give no impact to. They say it's important to check back on things and that they want to clarify this is a peaceful protest, but they don't give me an impact away here. And so that's going to be really important when you're looking at I provide tangible impacts in the case of we're trying to decrease structural violence, we're trying to decrease discrimination. All they're saying is we need to do make sure democracy functions because I don't know why. So let's go into the second advantage of discrimination. They say that there's current targeting of racial minorities, and that combatant decreases the ability to participate. Let's look at MLK again, right? People lined up to go to jail, basically. They would walk out and protest in the streets knowing that they were going to end up in jail. And so they're not decreasing their ability to protest. The protest is the fact that they're getting sanctioned. The fact that the one thing that they brought up in this round was people of color getting in trouble for kneeling for the national anthem shows that this is the discourse that we're talking about. We're talking about the instance where the oppressor oppresses, not the instance where they let them protest and nothing ever changed. And so you can see this is just turned by the second disadvantage, the second subpoint of class, this is turned by the second disadvantage. They're not getting any sort of class system that's going to change because the oppressor is just going to be able to decide what's going to happen. Onto the third advantage, they also don't really put an impact for this either, so I don't have a whole lot to weigh. I have to kind of assume it. Onto the third advantage of discourse, they say there's going to be more discourse, and this is the argument I start to get on again. One of the only things that we're talking about is the instance of the oppressor being bad. If we don't have an ability to take a moral high ground, we're just going to assume like we allowed them to protest, and I guess the protest didn't work, moving on, that's life. There is no clash in the world of the affirmation, it's just two sides saying something and nothing ever changes. The world of negation allows there to be clash, which will produce discourse. So we're turning this, we're actually allowing for more discourse to happen because we talk about things that are going to be clashing. They give an example of an apartheid. These protests happened in South Africa, they didn't happen in the United States. And so that's what you're going to see, like, there's no way, like, in the United States, that's not going to change things. You need to have that clash for there to be any sort of change. I vote nay.
Just off time, we're going to be going over, we're not going to have much framework, so I'm just going to skip over that. We're going to be going over two disadvantages, then going over and rebuilding our case. Everyone ready? Starting time now. So their first main impact is that we're going to be devaluing civil disobedience because people are going to be punished less. And they give one big example, and only one example. That's Martin Luther King. Now, for every one example that they give, there are millions that are going to be silenced. So they talk about the protests in the face of repercussions leads to more value of these events. We can see, but in the reality, we can see that events that, like the Women's March, where hundreds of thousands of crowds were drawn towards the Women's March, had a great impact on the way we perceive the Trump administration, had a great impact. And these are things that happen without repercussions. We saw that just the fact that hundreds of thousands of people took time out of their day to go and protest against something, that was a huge impact on society. Secondly, the main big impact they talk about here is apathy. So then they talk about how the people are just going to protest and be like, okay, I protested, I'm done now. But the people who are going to do that weren't going to be the people who protest in the first place. The people who are going to go and protest in apparently our world, and they're going to go and protest and then say, okay, I'm done. Obviously, they're not going to be committed to the issue, and obviously then they wouldn't have faced persecution to do so in the first place. This completely turns because we can see that the people who are not going to be protesting, the people who have to overcome more barriers, are going to be the people who are already oppressed. And they give you one example, but there are millions of examples where people are going to be oppressed and aren't going to speak out because they fear repercussions. What this means is you'll be disproportionately silencing the voices of those who are already silenced, and that's going to be the main impact here. The people that are protesting are going to be the ones who are white, are going to be the ones who are in power, and this is going to be seeing like the white people are helping the black people, when in reality, the black people aren't going to have the ability to help themselves, and so that's going to cause a perceptual it's going to cause a perceptual impact where we see those who are silenced can't actually speak for themselves, and that's a huge impact here. Sorry, I had to.
Yeah, of course. So going back up to your example of the Women's March, in your opinion, which movement has led to more change? Dr. King's work or the Women's March?
That's one example versus one, or that's just one example versus one example. I can give you Gandhi, who had the Salt March, who marched without repercussions, without being jailed, who had enormous impact on the state of India. I have to get a lot to get through. If I have more time, I will get to. Okay, then they talk about how MLK knew they'd react violently, but again, this is just one example of one man who was courageous enough to do it. These are going to be students and we see those who are going to say, okay, I'm done now, aren't going to be the ones who would protest in our world in the first place. Then they talk about oversight. So we're going to be taking the position that we're not going to ban any discourse. So we're not going to be in the position where we're going to be banning discourse, because that goes against what our case is all about, and that's the freedom of ideas. So number one, they say a lot of bad things are going to happen. They're going to be discourse, but we can see that the discourse is going to be a lot healthier, right? They give the example of the alt-right. If you're silencing the alt-right, they're just going to blow up more. We see this on the Berkeley campus, where you have the alt-right react so violently in result, and we're going to see more polarization, which is going to lead to less discourse, which is going to lead to the alt-right less likely to moderate. So if you want the alt-right to exist in the United States, vote for them, because they will just be penting them up on our youngest levels, telling them that their voices aren't willing to be heard. I agree that the alt-right should not exist, but the only way to get it to not exist is to give them a platform and have people tell them why they're wrong. Telling them you can't speak is not going to change their mind. That's not how the world works. Going on to our case, we can see that the first voter they should talk about is just a direct, or the first argument they talk about is a direct clash to their case. And that's basically them saying you need to break laws in order to have these impacts. Number one, we gave the example of apartheid. This example is completely misinterpreted. The college students were protesting in the United States against apartheid, and that forced the United States government to divest from apartheid, which led to the fall of apartheid. So that example flows through, and I'll get more to that later in the significance of that. But what we see is those people were marching without the fear of repercussions, and yet it caused huge amounts of change in the world. Huge amounts of change in the world. We got rid of apartheid in South Africa, which dehumanized an entire race of people. Then they talk about how we have no impact. My partner clearly talked about how we have less oppression in our world and how we have less violence. This is a clear terminalized impact. I don't know how further we're supposed to terminalize this. We're going to be having less oppression and less violence in our world. Yeah.
Were any of the people marching against apartheid people of color?
I don't know who was marching because it was literally hundreds or it was literally thousands of people. But this led to change, and then we get to see discrimination. They give one example of MLK versus the millions of people who are too afraid to protest because of the repercussions. Again, cross-apply what I said on DA1 about how when people are going to be around minorities are going to be afraid to speak for themselves, they're going to have someone else speaking for them. And this is not what we want in the United States. We want people speaking for themselves so that we can eliminate the dehumanization of an entire race or reduce the dehumanization of an entire race. And they talk about how we have no impact. Again, we extended the impact of less oppression. If you want to terminalize this even further, there's going to be less dehumanization. That's the impact. That's the only real refutation we saw there, and there is a clear impact. When we go to class, this was untouched. People who are afraid to, or people who are reliant on scholarships, reliant on grades, in order to do well in society, or in order to be able to feed their families, in order to succeed, are going to be a lot less likely to protest than those who have a trust fund and don't care about how they do in school. What this is going to lead to is an entire class of people not being able to, or disproportionately protesting and speaking for themselves. Again, this leads to more oppression, like I talked about earlier. Then we get to C3 discourse. They talk about how the people are going to move on. Again, the people who are going to move on after a mass protest in our world are not going to be the people who would stand up for oppression in their world. If people are so nonchalant about their ideas, like, oh, I did a protest, now I can go home, are not going to be people who are going to be standing up towards violence. That's completely ridiculous to assume. So that impact doesn't exist. They talk about how there's no clash. We don't want the violent clashes that they're perpetuating. What we want is an open discussion where we have people's minds. What they're going to say is that we need the oppressor to clash with the oppressed, but that's not what we need. Because again, extend what I talked about earlier about when you pent up an entire group and pit one group against each other, it's just going to lead to more radicalization on both sides. They're not going to be able to solve anything with that. The only way we solve this issue effectively is make sure that there's a open discussion between the two, so that we are able to moderate the ideas. Subpoint B completely dropped social progress, and the link we gave there was apartheid. All they said was students were protesting in South Africa, and that's not the case. Students were protesting in America, like I talked about earlier, and so this completely flows through. What we see then in this debate round and in the real world, that removing these barriers is going to lead for more social progress. And this is something that they have dropped here. And this is going to outweigh any impact they read you on some people, or on some complacency, or on some oversight. This outweighs everything because they have admitted that there's going to be more social progress in our world. Let's review. We go to the first dissad. They completely missed the point about how one example doesn't represent the entire African American population, and African Americans are going to be a lot less likely to speak for themselves. That's going to lead to others speaking for them and increased dehumanization of that race and of those people. Then we talk about how the people who would do this in the first place the people who would go home wouldn't even do this in the first place. And we talk about oversight. We're having more discourse, and that's going to lead to the moderation of the alt-right. For all these reasons, I urge a strong vote in the affirmation.
Everyone ready? Judges? All right. Starting off, I'd like to thank everyone. This is going to be my last speech in my high school career. I really appreciate you all coming out. I'm going to leave a framework really quick to learn the disadvantages and foundations in order. At the framework level, everything's pretty cut and dry. I'm just going to point out that they didn't respond to our observation, that we're just defending the status quo, taking no action. We don't have to advocate that like somehow stopping protests is good. We're just looking at schools doing nothing. With that out of the way, moving into the first disadvantage of civil disobedience. So first, in response to an example with using Dr. King's movement, they gave the example that the Women's March has like changed substantial things. And obviously, I'm not the person to speak to the state of misogyny in 2018, but I'm willing to make this statement that the majority of people who experience misogyny do not feel that the Women's March somehow erased it. I don't think anyone's going to make the argument that this has made a substantial impact towards tearing down patriarchal systems. Whereas I feel far more likely that we would be able to argue that Dr. King's movement has made substantial progress, has actually put legislation into the Constitution to fight for equal rights. Actual change has happened because of the jailings, because of the civil disobedience ingrained into his movement. I asked a question about which had more impact, and they just didn't really respond to it whatsoever. Just looked at the fact that it's clear to see that the civil disobedience engaged in by Dr. King had an enormous impact when compared to that achieved by the Women's March. Yeah.
Can you name one other example other than Dr. King?
Yeah, so you pointed out in the last speech that we only had one example, and that's true just due to time constraints. But then you gave us really two good examples that we could use in this round, talking about Gandhi and South Africa. And you tried to portray these off as sanctioned protests, which is just completely false. Gandhi was fighting against the British Empire, the largest colonial power, the largest power the world has ever seen. Fighting, like putting his life on the line, bringing himself to the brink of death, continually being beaten back physically. This is not an example. Yeah, people died during marches. This is not an example of a sanctioned legal protest that the government said was great. This was an example of people fighting to the death to overthrow a colonial power. This is an example of how civil disobedience and actual combat leads to the most substantial change. It has the potential to overthrow one of the largest powers this world has ever seen. Then they talked again about South Africa, and they tried to make the argument that it's like white, rich, college kids in the United States who overthrew apartheid and the British Empire. That is just so factually untrue. Let's look to South Africa, the actual place where apartheid was taking place. Let's look to Nelson Mandela sitting in jail for an extended period of time. We can see that it was actual civil disobedience within this country that brought the British Empire to this point. It wasn't just some people in the United States marching at their college campus. It was actual work on the ground by marginalized individuals in South Africa. Yeah.
So the U.S. divestment caused by the student protests didn't lead to the fall of apartheid?
I mean, sure, it helped, but if we look at the major work, if we look at the people who are actually doing the real work and achieve the most change, it's not people on college campuses in the United States, it's people on the ground in South Africa. That's the number one impact you're weighing. Then they talk about like others speaking for people of color if this passes, and that's exactly what they're advocating for. Like cross-apply our argument about essentially sanctioning protests. Like they're arguing that essentially the federal government should decide what protests are or not legitimate. That's essentially telling people of color or other marginalized groups what they can and can't say. Like it's okay to advocate do the Women's March, but it's not okay to have a Black Lives Matter rally. It's essentially the power structure determining what protests can be done. That is determining what people speak, not our example. And this is like people of color were not protesting. They make no response to Dr. King. People were lining up to go sit in jail. Like there's somehow just like the fact people are going to protest against oppression. This argument just makes no sense. All three of our examples, South Africa, Gandhi, and MLK, show that people will continue to protest in spite of this and do so effectively.
Risk is value to the protest.
Yeah, the risk gives value to the protest. Like doing something that has no actual danger has no value. Like if we're just doing something that's safe, we're never going to actually change anything. The risk that they speak of is what gives power and what gives weight to these protests in the first place. Moving into the second disadvantage of oversight. They make one argument here, which is essentially that alt-right will lash out if they're shut down. And I'm going to use a quote from Richard Spencer, which I never thought I would say. He himself said that the anti-fascist movements were successful in defeating the alt-right. Anti-fascists going out and combating the alt-right everywhere it appeared, doing so by any means necessary, was, in the eyes of the leader of the alt-right movement, successful. He believes it's the reason his movement is faltering. It's the reason he's stopping his college shoes. It's the reason the alt-right is shrinking. For protest that goes outside the law and protest that uses any means necessary is the reason this happens. Stopping the alt-right has destroyed it instead of emboldening it. Yeah.
So the alt-right is, in your words, dead?
I'm not saying it's dead. I'm saying that we saw it in a much larger position at this time last year, and the work by anti-fascist groups over the past year and a half have been incredibly successful in decreasing the movement, decreasing the profile, and leading to the downturn of the alt-right. While it has not disappeared, it is so much less substantial than it was at this time. Like Richard Spencer himself admits that they're losing. Like it's not just up for question. The leader themselves of this entire movement has admitted. They make no other response to this. So like flow through. They didn't respond to a point about like this leads to the government deciding what protest is and isn't legitimate. That was completely dropped. Flow that through. Like that alone is going to be a voting issue for the negation because they've conceded that their world leads to the government determining what can and can't be protest and solidifies oppression as the power structure continually determines what is and isn't okay. Moving into their case, starting off on the first advantage of civic engagement, we make the argument essentially that you value peaceful protests by breaking laws. And we use the example of apartheid here again, of how this was an example of no one breaking any laws and it led to change. And I'm just going to cross up with the exact argument I made earlier. Let's look at the actual work that led to the fall of the apartheid state. It was done in South Africa by actual leaders there. Like, they can't just continue to say that it was just people like marching and holding signs on U.S. campuses that actually did this. And then additionally, like, those protests weren't necessarily all sanctioned as well. Like, they give no reason why these marches were like deemed legitimate by schools. I'm willing to bet we saw large numbers of examples of schools combating this. We've seen throughout time schools combating this. They haven't actually proved that these are like school protests deemed legitimate by the federal government. Yeah.
In spite of protests in their homeland, wasn't apartheid able to survive for decades because of the economic support from the United States and its allies?
You're just trying to make a causation argument when there's clearly correlation here. Like, you can't argue that. First off, you can't argue that the protests in the United States, thousands of miles away, were the thing that pushed apartheid to its brink. And even if that's true, look to the fact that these protests most likely were not sanctioned. Colleges rarely do that sort of thing. This is probably a form of civil disobedience. It's almost guaranteed that there was some pushback by schools here and that there were people actually combating. That's what gave them the power. If schools were brought to the point where they were forced to negotiate and forced to withdraw economically because students made it inconvenient for them to continue doing the status quo. That's how protests work. They have to make it inconvenient. A convenient protest is no protest at all. It doesn't do anything, only by making it ineffective and making it no longer in the best interest of the school to continue the current policy. Could students actually change anything? So there's nothing here. In terms of their impacts, they claim they have impacts, but all the things were like people would respect democracy. What does that do? Does that make democracy better? We don't actually know. Like, just respecting something doesn't do anything to change it. What's the impact of that? It's just going to be outweighed by our actual impacts about solidifying oppression. And then the thing about peace isn't any impact whatsoever. They say like less violence. It's just going to outweigh structural violence. Is going to outweigh any form of protest on a college campus. Like racism and misogyny are bigger impacts. It's the bigger forms of violence than anything they put forward. That's just going to outweigh. Moving into the second disadvantage of discrimination, they took the they looked at say like other people are going to have to speak for people of color in this situation, and it's not going to be like them doing it themselves. Just look at the fact that in the world, essentially the college is determining what people can and cannot say, determining what protests are legitimate. I mean, not the college, the federal government. The federal government is determining whether or not it's okay. Like, think about whether or not Trump would determine that it's legitimate for Black Lives Matter protests to continue. It's just not going to happen. They're determining what can and cannot be said. That's speaking for people, not the world litigation. Then they make the argument that like the class argument was untouched. That's just not true. We said that the only way to change the class system is to engage in civil disobedience. They didn't respond to that whatsoever, so flow it through. And then moving into the third thing, they talk about discourse. Look at the fact that like the risk makes the discourse happen. Like, with the discourse, people will not move on if they care about it. Let's look at gun control. Recently, it was a really hot button issue at my school around the time of the 17 minutes of silence, and then it kind of vanished. Like, people who have been super active just stopped talking about it until yesterday, and it's going to die down again. We continue to see this happen. People talk about the issue and they'll die down. Even people who care passionately in the moment lose interest. It's only when it becomes a national thing. Like, we're still talking about Colin Kaepernick because it was such a large form of civil disobedience, because of the pushback. And then to talk about South Africa, the final thing, it's in my previous responses. Thank you all so much.
I'm just going to signpost as I go through. It's going to be a list of issues and some voters. And once again, before I begin, this is also my last speech, so thanks everyone for being here. Is everyone ready? Okay, let's talk about danger. Gandhi was in danger. People protesting the Vietnam War were in danger. People protesting apartheid, in South Africa or not, were in danger. Every protest against the United States federal government is inherently dangerous. I asked a question about whether or not there are people of color protesting in that, and they said yes. Literally, if you're a person of color protesting, there is a very good chance that you're going to be attacked by the police system. Everything that has a risk gives value. They dropped this argument. If there is no risk to the protest, we have no idea how important the protest is. The risks people take to protest something gives us a measure in which to know how important the issue is to them. If there is literally no risk to going out and protest something, we have no way of knowing and no way of rallying around something, because it could be someone's hobby or it could be someone's livelihood. Thus, when there is no risk, there is no progress, because you do not rally people around your cause. That gets into my second point of discourse. The negation's role causes discourse to happen. The reality is that when there is no conflict, people don't talk about stuff. When you just are allowing for things to happen and there's no major clash that happens, this is like a debate, right? Like, if there's no clash, then it's just two IEs, basically. And we, like, stop the debate after the 1 and C, and then you get to vote. Like, that's just not, like, worthwhile, right? The reality is that, like,
If you're allowing people just to go out and say things that there's no real clash, then there's not going to be any way to rally people around this. Look to school shootings. People are dying due to guns every single day, but they're just not all that known because it's not a major point of clash. It just seems to happen. It's ubiquitous in society. But then people start to rally around things when these major events happen because they cause discourse because they're so striking. Thus, when people are taking these risks, when they're potentially getting punished for protesting, when they're being put in jail, when they're getting suspended from class, that causes the discourse to happen. Allowing an open forum for discussion isn't going to promote discussion because people won't want to engage in the discussion itself. They're just going to allow the people to say their side and then go, okay, that was cool, and then just move on. Basically, the lack of ability to protest can be the rallying cry. Like, it's not like if you're being held, you're forced to stay in class, you can be making posts all over the place being like, I can't protest, go out there and do this for, like, go out there and support my cause even if I can't be there. Like, that's the way that you can rally people around this. Thus, the world of negation promotes discourse, it promotes clash, and it promotes change, and it does this uniquely. It does this much more effectively, and that's going to get me into voting issues. Basically, we're both trying to reduce discrimination. That's the crux of the issue. We want to make the world a better place. And so what that means is you're going to want to vote on probability here. You're going to want to value probability over everything else because we need to look at what's the most likely to actually change the status quo. What world is going to allow for there to be an increased chance to actually make things better? Sure, in the world of the affirmation, there's a chance that things get better. There's a chance that a perfectly sanctioned protest will make things better for some people. But the world of the negation has a much higher probability of doing so, and that is just proved by empirics. They laughed at us for providing one example, and then they literally only talked about apartheid. This is the nice thing about the Women's March too. So they've got two examples. Like you're just going to look to empirics. Like we turned all of their examples in terms of there's just empiric proof that protesting against oppressive systems works best when you're counteracting those systems, not when those systems are just like letting you protest. Like, can you imagine like the French Revolution if like they just were like cool with it? They're just like, you guys can do whatever you want, and you'd be like, wait, you don't want to like cut off our heads? Like, it just wouldn't make sense, right? It just it doesn't work nearly as well. And so, what you're going to be voting on here is the chance to reduce oppression relies on the ability to break the law of the oppressive system. When the oppressive system condones protest, they mitigate the value. They mitigate the ability to change things, and they mitigate the voices by decreasing discussion, by acting as if everything is going to be okay, as if it's not going to be a major issue, and they decrease rallying support. It's impossible to get people to go behind you if you're not able to convince them that it's even an issue in the first place. Thank you all once again. Vote for the negation.
All right. Off-time thank yous. This is also my last debate, so shockingly, I don't know. There's a lot of people in here. We've hit these guys 6 times this year. There's tons of people that have judged us, that have supported us, that mean a lot, that are just like cool. So I'd like to thank you all for being here today. It's pretty nifty stuff. I would almost cry. I cry very easily. Some people are aware. All right, ready to get going? Starting my time now. So, in the course of this speech, I'm going to go over some key reasons why I do believe from the bottom of my heart the affirmation is one of this debate. Starting first and foremost, let's talk about obstacles. Obstacles are hard. We make courses of them for fun, but they prevent you from doing things. The negation in this round is trying to argue to you that more obstacles for people protesting are good for the people protesting. Let's flow that through. We mentioned, my partner mentioned specifically, nice job, that people the people in these protests that we're going to be having in the status quo that we want to legitimize will not have individuals in them that they're trying to represent. That they will have disproportionately less or fewer minorities, fewer people of lower socioeconomic status. This was not refuted. They are creating obstacles and saying they're good. Unless you think that's a good idea, you don't. Then you're not going to vote nay. But before we get into why that plays in the round, let's talk about some examples here. So I'm going to talk about Gandhi because I mentioned the Gandhi example. My partner mentioned the Gandhi example specifically, and they tried to argue to you that Gandhi specifically stuffed jails and did all this stuff. They're absolutely right. This policy was known as Satyagraha. Satyagraha was not necessarily successful. As a matter of fact, Satyagraha was a policy ended in the 1920s. The policies Gandhi used after that were when he was not getting jailed anymore. He was not jailed after 1931 during the Salt March. He was not jailed later on. He was not jailed there. There was zero opposition. And in those years, what do we see happen? I don't know. The Congress of India finally got recognition. There was actual partition inside of there. We saw rights for untouchables. We saw tons of new things come into places there. This is the real change here. Gandhi didn't do that. They mentioned the MLK's example, and they tried to throw this through there, that this was necessary to them. What made the March on Birmingham so remarkable remarkable, in tandem with factors, was that it was so massive. The massiveness. These things are not going away. They are creating obstacles so protests cannot be as massive and they cannot be as reflective. Legitimately the opposite of what MLK would have them do. Then we get to South Africa. South Africa is a country. And what we see with South Africa, I hope we can all agree on that, they try to mention Mandela and other factors inside of South Africa, despite the fact that Mandela was in jail for the 20-some years prior to their independence. What changed? Their number one economic supplier, the United States of America, pulled out in response to collegiate protests in the United States. The only thing that changed in that period of time was the 1986 divestment. That's what we said was the response to collegiate protest. That's what they do. Their only reputation is Mandela, who literally could not be protesting because he was in jail at the time here. They dropped this. They tried to give that you were willing to bet there was minorities represented or probably minorities represented in these protests. They give you no warrant here. They give you no impact. They give you no reputation to protest and do actions in the United States that had tangible impact without facing consequences. Now we move on. What is our plan? I'd like to know. Our plan has a few different factors. Number one, their whole critique of our plan that they're trying to choose who speaks and who doesn't. No warrant, we refute it, there's nothing there. We aren't picking and chooses who talks at any given time. They also dropped the portion about lessons, that if we as a civic society allow our students to protest, we teach them the value of democracy. They dropped this. We are teaching them the lessons of civic engagement and increasing civic engagement. They completely dropped this point in the school. Then we talk about access. Flow, everything I've said about how the protests they want to grow cannot have as many minorities, it cannot have as many people of lower socioeconomic status. They limit the protests and then just let the tinier ones that aren't even as reflective and can't check abuses as much just go on. Our plan is something that enables more people to protest more. That is good. That's how we create this democracy. They mentioned the alt-right, and the alt-right is another example I'll touch on in this round. We talked about how the alt-right grew, and this is exactly true. In the fallout of the Berkeley protests against the alt-right in an attempt to silence them, alt-right members and alt-right views online skyrocketed. What combats them? Their only excuse is Antifa, who literally started riots and were violent against the alt-right. What they are advocating here for is that in the response to limitations on free speech or limitations on these protests, alt-right membership went up. They refused to acknowledge this in the round. Now we talk about impacts. They try to say we don't terminalize impacts. We clearly mentioned death, violence, dehumanization. You're going to see those all throughout the flow here because my partner tries to say humanization, so he has to say reduce dehumanization. It's really funny. But that's exactly what happens here. The impacts in this round are clear, but one impact that my partner mentioned was not refuted here. You're going to be flowing through social progress, the fact that they have made progress. Our C3 sub-point 2 didn't address. They ran out of time. They're going to flow. Social progress is an impact we have. They don't. Then we look against this, and we look at what we're debating in the status quo. Their reputation to the effectiveness of protest and the effectiveness of all of this stuff is that people are going to be lazy, which my partner refuted that the people that are going to be carrying out these protests are going to be the ones protesting anyways. They drop this reputation, and they deny that things like gun violence, when the introduction of gun bills was just introduced into Florida in the response of marches, doesn't exist. The reality of this debate comes down if you think that more people protesting more and being able to do so to a higher extent is good for democracy, is good for the people in the democracy, and people as a whole. The answer to that is yes, and the answer to your ballot is affirmation. Thank you.